Hi, I just wanted to provide some talking points regarding Leading with Data, Chapter 1. Just wanted to highlight a couple things, not necessarily talk through every slide here, but really the emphasis of this chapter is that there's been a lot of driving influences as to why we're leading up to now database decision making and why it has such a precedence and importance in our schools now. There's a lot of different organizations and assessments that are going on that are kind of pushing schools to be more standards based. Even at state levels, states have adopted that. Now with Common Core, we're possibly moving to a national assessment with the Common Core tests, having the Common Cores throughout the states. But there's other state level type of assessments that are kind of driving these standards. But the real emphasis here is that because of these historical reform movements where in the past where we've been minimum competency based, now we're getting to levels of proficiency and we're standards based, is we're deciding what students should know and be able to do. And then based on those standards, we want to see how they perform according to those standards, those performance standards. So that's really driving this accountability era, is this standards assessment. The difficulty then is when we create these standards is aligning that curriculum with the way we teach and aligning our assessments with those standards. And it creates a difficulty, for future, especially as we're adopting the Common Core now, in considering what are the responsibilities, for you as a future school leader, and what would you need to do to align your curriculum with these standards. And consider experience that you've had in the past. As have you ever done a curriculum alignment, or both at a classroom or school, or even at a district level? And each of those requires a different investment of energy and effort, and they're very complex and very time-consuming, and they take a lot of effort by individuals to align that curriculum with those standards. Another thing to consider is with assessment, that's really driving our standards of understanding how we're doing, whether we've mastered those standards. And we look at data, and we can disaggregate that data now by different groups. And we can look at ethnicity, we can look at language proficiency, we can look at income, mobility, lots of different possibilities of disaggregating that data and considering how assessment is informing our standards. So I want to propose a couple questions to you. What data are you currently using in your classroom if you're teaching? How do you use that data? How do you consume it, digest it? How does it inform your next steps? And then think about in your school. What data do you have at your school that you have access to? How is that data used? And think at the district level and even at the state level. And there's an example in the textbook you can see on page 11 and 12, actually from the state of Tennessee. The author, Ellen Goldring, is from Tennessee. She teaches at Vanderbilt. But you can see they have state testing about AYP. And you can take a look at that data. The emphasis in this class is, from the leadership perspective, what is your role in planning and delivering this type of professional development to help your teachers be ready to use data and use data-based decision-making in a proficient way? So how does your school provide data-based decision-making training? How does your school provide training, professional development training anyway? And that's part of it, is how can we help our teachers improve their practice to better help our students perform on these standards-based assessments. And there's a lot of different type of scoring, and here it talks about normed scores, and there's some examples, and here's an example of a question on a norm reference test. And there's a lot of debate as to whether this question actually measures what it's intending to measure. But other types of assessment, there's the CRTs, which we're moving from here in Utah, is where we have a statewide assessment, and it's validated and tested throughout the state, and then we have a criterion reference test, and so on. There's different diagnostic tests, often used to identify special education students or needs or different types of assessments. But these are a listing of those different types of diagnostic assessments. And here's some terminology in regards to statistical measures. And one thing to consider as a future leader are things that when we have data and dealing with students, how do we communicate that type of data with our constituents, with our parents? And always FERPA, remembering the privacy and confidentiality of records. Always ensuring that it's not when we have data and we're trying to make improvements, things aren't always set in stone. That's one thing we can count on in education. It's dynamic. And we want to look at discrepancies between tests and subtests. That's why we need to take multiple types of assessment to triangulate and really identify what's accurate. And then helping parents even understand what a test means and be able to explain that to them. The last thing that the textbook really talked about is accountability. We really live in an era of accountability. There's an external accountability where we answer to a larger group, the state, political, bureaucratic type. But there's this market accountability where we have competition. Public schools are not the only choice out there. And then we have an internal accountability where we're left to our school norms and the expectation of our stakeholders and our teachers and our parents and even our students. So there's an internal accountability that's also driving that. So that's one thing with this first chapter, just wanted to emphasize and maybe make some points about for you to consider and to think about, and how we're approaching data as our first chapter we've talked about in leading with data.